Hello, my name is Gail Berry West. I'd like to welcome you to our latest exhibition here at Mount Vernon. I am the Vice Regent for the District of Columbia to the Ladies of Mount Vernon, and this exhibition is entitled Lives Bound Together, Slavery at George Washington's Mount Vernon. It will open formally tomorrow, October 1st, and we welcome you to come. This exhibition took years of planning and preparation and research. We're going to walk into the first gallery and meet the Senior Curator, Dr. Susan Schoelwer, who will tell us more about the lives of the enslaved here at Mount Vernon.
Good afternoon, Mrs. West. I'm so glad to give you a bit of a preview to the exhibition. You know, even though the enslaved people at Mount Vernon didn't leave their own written records, we have so much material here to learn about their lives. We have references in Washington's papers, we have archaeological artifacts, and we're even using household furnishings from the Washingtons to help us understand the enslaved people better.
Great.
So here we have, for example, this silver coffee urn, which the Washingtons would have used to serve tea or coffee on the piazza. Behind the urn, you see a silhouette of Frank Lee, the enslaved valet, who would likely have been the one who brought the urn in, who would have poured the coffee into the coffee cups. He was probably the person who met you at the door if you came to visit the Washingtons.
Absolutely. And I see here we have a monitor that we could start and learn more about Frank Lee.
Absolutely. This is so you can dig deeper if you want to know more. We have a timeline that you can find out what happened to him on particular days. And we have charts where you can find out more about his family and the people he was related to here at Mount Vernon.
I think it's very interesting that Frank Lee, who we have here as the butler, welcoming guests, that he had a brother named William Lee, who I think was a very important person in George Washington's life. He was his body person, as we call today, the true valet, who was with him here at Mount Vernon and during the Revolutionary War. William Lee was very close to George Washington, perhaps the closest of his enslaved people.
Yes, and here we get to meet William Lee in the context of learning about George Washington's changing views on slavery. The Revolution was an important part of that, and he could see how William Lee and other enslaved people who fought, really demonstrated their valor.
Absolutely. Now we come over to another very famous enslaved person at Mount Vernon, and also in Philadelphia when the president lived in there lived in Philadelphia during the Constitutional Congress and when he was first president.
Right.
This is
exactly George Washington's cook.
Wonderful. He has a story to him, though, unfortunately. He's one that ultimately left, unbeknownst to George Washington, on his 65th birthday and was never really heard of again. But tell us about this portrait. How did he come to have a portrait painting?
Well, that's one of the great mysteries, and we don't know the answer to that, but we're delighted to have the portrait here. It's quite famous, and it's come all the way from Madrid, Spain, on loan from the Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza. We have it hanging here next to a portrait of George Washington. They're both attributed to Gilbert Stuart, and Washington's, of course, is the face you see on the dollar bill.
Isn't that wonderful?
But how the cook came to have his portrait painted, we don't know.
But we do know that he left, and he was one of the slaves that was never heard of again. Now we go into another gallery where we actually can tell from archaeological digs what we have here at Mount Vernon for all to see. Let's go over and see some of the things that we've been able to uncover.
Right, and I think in many ways this is this is sort of the heart of the exhibition. Because it really focuses on the lives and work of the enslaved people here on the plantation and how they made it actually operate. So in this case, we have examples of household furnishings from the enslaved people themselves. These are things that have been excavated from their quarters, so we can see what they used.
Interesting. And you told me once that this might be a chamber pot.
This is a chamber pot because, of course, no one had
Right.
indoor plumbing, neither the
Absolutely.
Washingtons nor the enslaved. There are pipe stems, wine bottles, plates, pottery, bowls, all the kinds of things they would have used in their daily living.
Fascinating. There's so much here at this exhibit that we hope that you will come. And if there are questions that you want to post, we would be happy to respond.
So while we're waiting for questions, I might just mention we also have archaeology that helps us understand what people ate in addition to their assigned rations. We have fish bones and animal bones and nuts and plants and seeds, so much really information.
When does the exhibition open?
Oh, it opens tomorrow, October 1st. It formally opens tomorrow.
Yeah, and it will be open for 2 years.
And how long has the exhibition been in the planning?
Oh, you would say many years.
Well, we've been actively working on it for 3 years, but the research, the archival research and the archaeology has been going on for more than 2 decades.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to note about the founder of Mount Vernon, who was one of the first, the Regents, and she was asked at that time, and this is Anne Pamela Cunningham, at the time she acquired Mount Vernon, and it was in a state of disrepair, why don't we just tear down the slave quarters? And she said, oh no, we want to show how it was at Mount Vernon when George Washington lived, and we'll preserve it as it was on the day he died. And such is the case.
So what do you hope people will learn by seeing this exhibition?
What's your first goal for that?
Well, our first goal is to really understand more about the lives of the people the enslaved people at Mount Vernon and how closely their lives were intertwined with the Washingtons. You really can't understand one without the other.
Yes. And I think that it will show people that George Washington loved Mount Vernon, but those who really made it the great estate that it was meticulously maintained, were the enslaved people. George Washington could not have had the life that he had without the enslaved people, and that should be recognized.
And how many enslaved individuals were living here at Mount Vernon?
317 at the time of his death.
Were they all here at Mount Vernon, or were they in other locations too?
He had 5 farms, and they were appropriately dispersed to those 5 farms. And various numbers would be at the Mansion Farm, another one at Dogue Farm. They would have different numbers depending on how many they needed where.
And an entrance to the museum is included in general admission, correct?
Absolutely.
What other places, how else can you learn about the story of slavery here at Mount Vernon?
Well, we'll be selling a wonderful book that accompanies this exhibition, and it's entitled Lives Bound Together, and it will tell the story of all 19 of the slaves that we have here in the exhibition, and much more detail about lives of the slavery at Mount Vernon.
We're putting information on our website as well, on our digital encyclopedia about George Washington. And when you're actually here visiting, we incorporate the stories of the enslaved and the regular tour of the mansion. And there's also a special tour called the Enslaved Community, the Enslaved People of Mount Vernon. So many opportunities.
Was George Washington a good slave owner?
I'd like to try to take a stab at that. I don't know if you could call anyone a good slave owner when you really think about being good. But I think he thought of himself as being a justified, good slave owner. His people did have enough to eat, they did have shelter, they did have clothing. But he expected the slaves to produce what he felt he had invested in them to make a profit. He was first a businessman and decided economically that he wanted his slaves to put in a good day's work for, unfortunately, not a good day's pay, but at least for food and rations for his family, for each of them to have. So I don't know if you could call him good, but It was a subject he wrestled with, so he tried to be, I think, a good slave owner in his own mind. But if someone was not cooperating, one man was especially sold back to the Caribbean, and I'm sure at that time he did not think George Washington was a good slave owner.
Did slaves did they resist their captivity here?
We don't have any insurrection records. There were people who were unhappy, as Hercules was when he came back from Philadelphia, and he was not a chef at that time. He was required to work out in the field and the vegetable gardens and actually pressing gravel on the front drive. So I think he left. And so there is an example of someone leaving. And then we have another example of a young woman who was a slave to Martha Washington, who also left. So we have individual cases of unhappiness who, took it upon themselves to leave. But we don't have a general populace that's, having an insurrection like Nat Turner, for example.
No, but there are, it's very interesting, demonstrated examples of more subtle resistance. Things like saying, I really don't feel well today, I can't work, breaking tools, losing things, theft. Washington is always complaining about these kinds of things. And of course, it's hard to tell, what is real illness and what is, I don't quite feel well today. So there certainly are examples of that kind of more passive or subtle resistance.
Ron Chernow, who's written a definitive biography of George Washington, relates a story of a slave that had evidently one arm that was in a sling. He'd been injured. And George Washington went over and said to him, he'd put his hand in his pocket to demonstrate that I could still rake with my good hand. And so you can do something. So he was quite concerned that everyone do what they needed to do and not relax about it and pretend not to be able to work.
What happened to the slaves here at Mount Vernon at the point of Washington's death?
As we know, George Washington was one of 8 presidents that was a slave owner. And he is the one of the 8 that freed his personal slaves, and I think that was 125?
123.
123 he was able to free, but there were 317 slaves here. The remainder of the slaves were owned by Martha Washington and were called dower slaves that he could not free. But I think we should point out, I think it's wonderful because of the respect that he had for William Lee, who was his valet, that he was the one slave that George Washington actually freed outright, and also gave him an allowance or a stipend of $30 for the rest of his life annually.
And he remained here at Mount Vernon, and there are stories of old Revolutionary War veterans coming here to visit and specifically wanting to talk to William Lee because they remembered being with him in the Revolution.
Wonderful. And we believe that he is buried in the slave cemetery here at Mount Vernon.
There's a question about food for the enslaved population here. How did they receive food? Where did they get their food? Do we know much about that topic?
We do know what they got a standard weekly allotment that was handed out to them by the farm managers or overseers, and that consisted of ground cornmeal, which they could make into various kinds of mush or pancakes or hoe cakes, that kind of thing, and dried fish. But we also know from archaeology, where we've dug up countless animal bones, fish bones, nuts, seeds, that they were able to vary their diets and add the nutrients that they needed by their own enterprise. So by fishing, by hunting, by raising chickens, by having small gardens. So because of archaeology, we know a lot about their diets.
And we have a gun here that was used by the slaves to actually hunt. So they were able to perhaps, get a pheasant.
Absolutely, the duck.
A pheasant, a duck, and they would be able to supplement their food that was given to them by the Washingtons.
There's another question about whether the enslaved population was able to derive income of their own. What do we know about that?
Yes.
That's a fascinating question, and that was one of the most surprising things to me when I started working on the research for this exhibit, is that slaves were able to earn their own income. Household slaves might have gotten tips from guests. You were expected to tip the slaves who assisted you. They were also able to earn small amounts of cash from hunting or fishing. They could sell what they caught back to George Washington. They could sell produce from their garden plots. And they were also allowed to go to the market in Alexandria on Sunday mornings to sell some of this produce and game.
How much do we know about Martha Washington and her insights into the world of slavery?
I think my thoughts on that are Martha Washington was very blessed. She was born into wealth. Slavery was a part of the fabric of America at that time, and Martha perhaps expected slavery to always exist. It was the way she lived, it was the way she had been brought up, and she expected to have a personal slave, and that was a story of a young woman who worked for her from the age she was 10 years old. And when they moved to Philadelphia, this young woman actually left too. She was one who just walked away, and she was taken in by a family of freed Black Americans at that time, or Africans Americans at that time, and was then whisked off to New Hampshire. And years later, she wrote her memoirs of that time, and she said, Martha, unfortunately, did not teach me to read. She did not teach me anything about Christianity. So I think Martha felt entitled to her slaves, and ultimately she did free her slaves as well. They were freed upon her death, and she, I think, even before, a year before she died, she freed George Washington's slaves that were to be freed upon her death a year in advance of her death. So I think Martha felt slavery was part of her life and she was entitled to it.
And what do we know about the descendants of Washington's slaves today?
We have many. We have many, and with this opening tomorrow, many of them will be here. They're descendants of enslaved, the Quander slave, the Syphax family, the Caroline Burnham family. Mm-hmm. We have several of the families that still can trace their ancestry back to this plantation, as we call it today. He called it his farms.
Thank you, Mrs. West and Dr. Schoelwer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We hope you will all come and visit the exhibition. I think it's a very important exploration of our American history.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.